You're fine.
This Senate Education Committee on May 1st, 2025. We're after 3. We are working on the education reform bill. And we left off yesterday among a lot of events out there, but one of them was one bit of language change and then a couple of issues, but the language change that we asked legislative council to do for us, St. James, she can walk us through. So I know we have in front of us now draft 7.1, which I believe has that small change. That was right.
Yes. That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. You have draft 7.1 of your proposal of amendment. And the only change between draft 6.1, which we walked through yesterday, and this draft is on page Okay. Thank you.
This is
Thank you.
7.1, correct?
Yes, draft 7.1 is on page 40. Do you want me to share my screen or are you okay with just your
I think
paper
it's,
copy?
I think read the hang on one second. It's point for Yes, so on page 40 of 7.1.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you want me to share my screen or?
I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. So we're in section, if we go to page 39, we're in section 17, which are the various reports you are asking from the Agency of Education. And on page 40, I've amended the language regarding the report on expanding flexible pathways opportunities. And so on page 40, line 14, this language now reads, on or before December 1st, 2026, the Agency of Education, in consultation with the Office of Workforce Strategy and Development, shall submit a written report with recommendations on how to increase flexible pathways opportunities for students in the commercial and nonprofit sectors. There was discussion yesterday about the workforce czar. From the best I'm able to tell, this is the office that was a reference to the Office of Workforce Strategy and Development.
Agency. Sorry.
Oh, that's a great question. See? I don't want. I'm making an assumption in my head. Let's see if I'm right. Looks like they're attached to the Vermont Workforce Development Board, and that is as specific as I can get. Their executive director is Sabina Haskell, who I believe is who you all were referring to yesterday. And if you weren't, I will need some more specific direction. Yeah, okay.
Okay. Everybody good with this language? That's what we asked.
Sorry, I'm paging the memo. Page 40, line 14. Flexible pathways encompasses CTE. Correct. Okay, then I'm good. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to check.
Okay, so are we good with that language? Okay. So one of the things left open after yesterday, was the issue of the, students out of state for 25 miles. And we asked, Alder Wilson with Visa to take a look at that and come back to us. So just as a refresher for people, right now, you can go anywhere in the world with tuition dollars. The 25 miles brought it way in from the world to within 25 miles of the border. And now we're looking at how to further refine that language. And so the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Oliver Olson here on behalf of the Vermont Independent Schools Association. And we're here actually, even though for the Vermont Independent Schools Association, we're obviously talking about schools outside of Vermont. So a little awkward, but so yesterday I was asked for data on out-of-state tuition, and the rough approximation I gave was 100 students in independent schools outside of Vermont. I scrubbed the AOE data from fiscal year 24 last night, and it may be closer to 114. And as I alluded to yesterday, the data is all essentially crowdsourced from the field and then rolls up to the AOE and is coded in the field. And then when it gets to the AOE, what I found is looking at the data, and I literally looked through like all of these schools and the students, is there are sometimes inconsistencies in the data. So I discovered last night that there were a few schools that were coded as public schools out of state. And when I looked at them, I realized that they were actually independent schools. That being said, there are some independent schools that are coded as independent, or excuse me, there are some public schools that have been coded as independent schools. I've left them in for now. So I feel reasonably confident the number is no less than 114 and likely somewhere below that. So where, as I looked at a few different constructs that were discussed yesterday, and I know senators have been interested in perhaps bounding this by some sort of mileage framework. So I did some analysis to look at the schools that are out of state, where they're located, and I literally went through every school with Google Maps to try to figure out like where they're at. And I think what I would propose as perhaps a surgical approach to address the concerns that were raised yesterday, what I would propose is, so I'm going to put a proposal on the table for you to think about, and then I'll give you the numbers that what that would actually translate into in terms of numbers. So if you were to limit out-of-state tuition to independent schools located within 25 miles of the Vermont border that serve one or more students paid with Vermont public tuition during the 2023-2024 school year.
Can I stop you right there?
Yes.
Does that include Canada? Or
That would include Canada,
Okay.
yes. Quebec specifically. So for the 24 school year for grades 9 through 12, not surprisingly, very few students were tuition out of state for the lower grades. It's probably the upper grades. So with that construct, those parameters, in FY24, there were 55 schools that those 114 students were tuition to. The limitation, the framework that I just described, would remove 19 schools that aren't on the border of Vermont, would further remove another 20 that are beyond the 25 miles, and 4 that only serve students in grades K to 8. So this would, by my estimation, would result in approximately only 12 independent schools outside of Vermont that would remain eligible for public tuition. And with a caveat that there are 2 that are right on the edge of the 25 miles. So it could be 12, it could be 13, it could be 14, but somewhere in that range. And if those restrictions had been in place in 24, I would estimate that only 39 of the 114 students would have been eligible for tuition.
And that is, yes, so.
Did you have a question? It's terrible. I'll think of it.
Yes,
Is this language that we're putting this framework under, this may not be a question for you. It also is led by the only eligible students being ones in non-operating district.
So the assumption is
Yeah.
that it's the current law construct, yes.
Okay.
Now,
yes.
are these all any special needs students in this?
Thank you, Craig. I should have qualified that. I'm only talking about gen ed students, so the therapeutic school exemption would still apply, and there certainly are a number of students. I don't have the exact numbers to hand, but there are a number of students in Vermont who have special education needs that cannot be met in the state. So I would strongly encourage you to not modify that, because you'd be impeding access to education for those kids who don't have an opportunity here.
So if we change this to a 25-mile radius, you don't have, under the current contract, only 39 students would have fell.
Yeah, obviously I can't predict what's going to happen in the
No,
future, but
Under
yes,
current, just
Yeah.
current, yeah.
Yes.
That's and how much further out were the other students? Did you kind of have that? Or another 5 miles or another? I know that's asking a lot.
yeah,
but-
it's a range. I have to go back to my visuals of Google Maps last night, but it's in a range. Most of them are just to give you a sense, there were 19 schools that were outside of the adjoining states, if you will. So I saw one in Pennsylvania, I think. There were 14 schools in New Hampshire, 4 in New York, 17 in Massachusetts, and 1 in Quebec.
Was there also no parameters around what the school had to demonstrate to the state of Vermont that it would at some baseline that it would meet?
So under current law, they are required to be approved under the laws of
Their own.
their own jurisdiction. And, I think beyond that, that would be a question for legislative council, but my memory serves that you start getting its extraterritorial issues to consider.
But couldn't you still say that AOE has to they should know where those kids are going and have some record that they've approved of their general education program.
So under current law,
Yeah.
they have to be approved under the laws of that jurisdiction.
But our AOE doesn't make any determination that that meets the standards of.
From my experience and knowledge, I can only speak from that. From prior life and other roles. My understanding is that is something that's handled by the local school district. And I'm familiar with, I can think of one specific example where there was a local school district that denied payment because there was some concern that receiving school didn't meet the requirements of that particular jurisdiction. But that is incumbent upon
So
the
it's
school district.
still all up to the sending district if they approve the.
If they make a determination that the school meets that statutory definition, and then there's an appeal process if the parents
Okay.
agree.
Okay, but the sending district has full jurisdiction over that decision.
Over the decision as to whether the school meets the test. Yes.
Okay. Do they then get counted in our QS and our proficiency standards? Like, do we include their, whether it's a public or independent school, do we include their test taking metrics in the metrics for students that go to school in Vermont?
I can't speak specifically. I think that'd be a question for
Ailey.
for yeah, exactly. But I think it's fair to say when you're dealing with students who are being tuitioned, whether they're going to a public school, and I should hasten, we're talking about, 114 down to 39 students. There are significantly more students who are being tuitioned to public schools out of state, and I would highlight that there are some schools where Vermont students are being tuitioned where there's actually, I'll just leave it at that.
Different standard. But did you find that all of the public schools that are tuitioned to are within 25 miles of?
Oh, I did not look at the distance, mainly
Uh-huh.
because there are so many more students. But I would say anecdotally, yes, they're generally speaking, whether they're independent or whether they're in a public school, they're
It's
generally.
because of a historical geography
Yeah, exactly.
issue.
Did you forward that language to Will?
I
I'm not worried about
Yeah.
that. I'm not worried about that. Okay. Just on our.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
Thank
Thank you.
for that.
thank you. So if we can have Secretary Saunders, something up?
Okay.
Do you want to do it?
And I think we have Amanda. Yeah. Dr. Brown is reading the witness.
She has joined. So I think the committee has become aware through different channels of the fact that well, I'll let you do your own part in a minute, but as watching the committee proceed, and then doing some additional work with your consultant on weights, and you wanted to have us consider within the framework of what we've been talking about in this committee, looking at a different methodology for weights, for basic weights. And so when you did that, after a little discussion, thought it made sense to have you come in and present. Which, as you know, we've been doing a lot of work on how to put together the foundation formula with basic weights. But you approached with wanting us to look at it, take a look at it, do it with different methodology that you've worked with, so we wanted to hear it. So I'll just say that. And so if you introduce yourself to the record and
Good afternoon. First, we'll do introductions. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Children Campbell, Deputy Secretary of Education.
We're also joined by Dr. Amanda Brown from APA.
Hi, all.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us to this conversation today. We have been, listening to testimony and also listening to the questions that you've posed throughout the discussion, and wanted to come back with a proposal for an enhanced evidence-based model. And this is really a refinement from the conversation that we've started having in January, and is building upon the feedback that we've heard from the field, and also the direction that you are headed as a committee. I think one of the differences that you're proposing from the House plan is to move towards one foundation formula. The House plan contemplates moving towards a cost-based analysis first within a 5-year ramp, and then moving to an evidence-based model in the future. And so your direction to move to one foundation formula, we think is appealing and would really help with creating a path forward to really support education quality. And what we're bringing forward today is an enhanced evidence-based model. And so I want to do a little bit of a recap around what an evidence-based model is, the adjustments that we made when we first proposed it in January, and then what you're seeing is different in what we're talking about today. And you might be asking, as you look at the number, so why does it matter? And it matters because the number that we put in law is important and it needs to mean something. And so as you're talking with your constituent, they're probably going to ask you questions around how did you get to that number? And we've heard in your conversations, you want to make sure that we're taking an empirical evidence-based approach to this work. And so that's what we're bringing forward to you today, and really looking at the policy assumptions that are built in to this enhanced evidence-based model. And I want to keep in mind that those are assumptions. They are not prescriptive. They are not set in stone, but they are important to articulate because all of us as a state need to be able to clearly communicate how this funding can deliver a substantially equal education across our state. And this also taking this approach and really clearly articulating those assumptions is helpful for us as next session, we talk more around defining the quality measures. So while there's a lot of flexibility in here, it provides a really important roadmap and also allows us as a state to be able to ensure that if implemented, we can, based on research and evidence, demonstrate how we can operationalize this approach in a way that is going to support quality. So as we walk through this, and just as a recap, the evidence-based model is a research-based approach. The General Assembly commissioned a study from Ficus and Onan to really evaluate how we might fund our systems differently to support equity. As we reviewed that approach, we as an agency worked with our consultant to make some revisions to the evidence-based model. And we've been calling it the adjusted evidence-based model. Those adjustments were based on input that we heard from the Listen and Learn Forum, things that we knew were really important to implementing education within the Vermont context. So just as a high level overview, some of the adjustments that we made originally included an adjustment to assumptions around size, knowing that we do have smaller schools, also increased support for mental health, increased funding for teacher salaries, ensure that there was a wide range of elective offerings for middle and high school students, and also increase access to career and technical education starting in middle school, along with increasing access to pre-K. All of these are very much shared objectives that we see listed in your bill as well. And it's important as we're making these decisions around funding that we can ensure that the choices that are being made are really supportive of delivering on those quality metrics. But we have heard a lot of feedback on that adjusted evidence-based model that we think are important for us to acknowledge and to address. So over the course of the last several months, we have been organizing policy sprint teams that have had representation from superintendents and principals and other education leaders across Vermont to really give us constructive feedback and to surface considerations that are important for us to hear and to share with you so that we're able to refine the approach to meet our shared objectives. So as we walk through today, some of those adjustments are coming from the feedback that we've heard. Others are also consistent with some of the refinements that the House made in their bill, and also consistent with the intent language that you put forward in your bill, along with the desire to move towards a foundation formula that will be the consistent way to fund education moving forward, so that we're not in a position of shifting to a different foundation formula into the future. The other really important thing that we were looking at is the overall cost for funding our system. That's important because I think up to date in the committee conversation so far, it's been a real focus on the education payment, which is an important aspect. But we need to make sure that as a state, we're looking at the overall cost of education that includes also categorical grants, to support our system. And so what we're bringing forward is really an all-in kind of assumption around how to fund our education system. So I'm going to walk through, I think you should have this document uploaded. I'm going to walk through some of the adjustments that have been made with this enhanced evidence-based model. And then we can dive into some of the details around the data, unless there's specific questions before I get started. Any specific questions?
No way.
Okay. So one thing we looked at in this enhanced model was allowing for an increase in average instructional salaries by 10%. And so that would include teachers, interventionists, and instructional coaches. We also recognize that the Vermont context, there's a preference for operating smaller elementary schools. And so in our adjusted evidence-based model, which we first presented in January, we assumed that there would be a different cost to operating a smaller school below the standard built in. And we did account for that. But I think in the last couple of months, we've recognized that that floor for efficiency may not be the floor for efficiency in Vermont. And so what we've done is we've actually adjusted that base level down to 300 students. So I want to clarify here, that doesn't mean that every school in our system will need to have 300 students for elementary school. And that's a really important distinction. But it means that the point of efficiency is 300 as opposed to 450. So we're making that adjustment really specific to the Vermont context. So what does that mean? So if you have an elementary school that's lower than 300, we're going to talk through how there would be an adjusted rate for those schools, because it would be more expensive to deliver education in the smaller settings. And we'll walk through how we've identified a ramp to smooth that out. But that is an important distinction and comes with a different cost that I think that the Vermonters would embrace. We also did decrease the average class sizes. This was responsive to some of the feedback we heard from the Vermont Superintendents Association. It gets closer to the recommendations that they put forward and provides greater differentiation by grade bands. Again, this is not prescriptive, but this is just what we've put into the modeling. And I think that's an important basis for us to begin, and also to show that there's closer alignment within this modeling to, I think, the desires expressed in the field that may be more aligned to the Vermont context. This enhanced model also increases staffing to allow for multi-tiered systems of support. As we were having the policy sprint team conversations, we heard from educators a concern that our adjusted model was going to defund multi-tiered systems of support, making it an unfunded mandate. And that we really thought about that. And so in this enhanced model, we're ensuring that this can support resourcing an additional interventionist and an additional MTSS assessment coordinator, because we know that having a multi-tiered system of support is going to be really critical to support quality and resourcing our school buildings with the staffing that's needed. We also, this is more of a technical piece where we can get into it, but funded all full-time preschool students. So as we look at all of the students that are coded for early education, there is a group for early special education. Previously in our model, they were not included. They have been added in Vermont. On the next page, we adjusted funding for the necessarily small schools. And this also is what I was describing before. We know that in Vermont, we are not going to land on a cookie cutter approach. Every school is not going to have the same enrollment size. There's going to be variation, and we need to account for that. So we'll allow Dr. Brown to get into more detail, but we've created a curve there for those that are necessarily small schools, making those adjustments. In this enhanced model, we did eliminate the district sparsity adjustment. And that's because we are assuming larger districts and that there would be more inequality across those districts, allowing more dollars to address school size. So that's an adjustment. We also,
Actually, should we pause there for 1 sec? Just around the equal districts, I just, and I might call on Dr. Brown to respond to this. So we are not positing any specific governance structure in this
Right.
modeling. It goes back to the evidence-based model from Picus and Auden and what is an efficient district. So I just want to be really clear about that, like there is no specific governance structure that goes into these base modeling assumptions, except for the base modeling assumptions that come with the EB base, which is that it's 3,900, Amanda?
Yes.
It's been a minute.
Exactly. Yep. Nope. You're spot on.
Over and over again. So just want to verify that.
so go ahead.
It's a follow-up to that. I'm kind of confused. So it's
Mhm.
not assuming a change in governance, but it is assuming that future districts will have
let
at
me-
least 3,900 students.
It is assuming a change in governance. It is not assuming 5 districts. It is not assuming 11 districts, but it is assuming a floor of 3,900 for each district. Because that's the minimum that's based in this model. As that committee evaluates the district configurations, we would want to establish some parameters, right? So if you're going below some of these minimums, there's different costs associated with it because you're not achieving scale. But this does assume that we are moving closer to scale. The other thing we did is we set back, and this has always been about understanding how to support education quality. And we've talked a lot about the importance of expanding access to college and career readiness opportunities. We are seeing a lower graduation rate. We are also seeing low persistence levels. So when students graduate high school and they enter post-secondary, we're seeing low persistence, meaning they're not completing the program. And so we think that there's value in being able to add a college and career readiness weight, and that would be for middle and high school students to allow for the addition of additional college and career readiness teacher in middle school and 2 in high school, along with additional counseling support for students and work-based learning coordinator as well. And then you'll notice here that we have made some adjustments in terms of the cost of materials. Also in middle and high school, that is above and beyond what was included in our adjusted evidence-based model.
And again, not prescriptive, but for the purpose of modeling, what would a high quality system look like if it was preparing students for college and career afterwards, right?
And again, the intention here as we're making recommendations around funding is ensuring that we can connect that to quality education in this system. We know that there needs to be further conversations that section around what would be a requirement. That's different than really establishing that there is the ability to deliver on these expectations. The next is to reduce the English learner weight to 1.4. It does generate a similar amount of funding per student as originally proposed in the adjusted EV model. It has been adjusted based on the adjustment in the base amount. So the base amount that we're putting forward is higher than we put forward in the adjusted EV model. And as we've had a lot of conversations around, you have to look at weights in relation to the base. And so some of those adjustments are just simply based on these adjustments of weight are based on the fact that we've adjusted the base. And so you're able to get more at that base amount of services. Similarly, with that line of thinking, as we reduce the CTE center weight to 1.0, and this is because as part of the enhanced model, we're increasing the weight for the college and career readiness that we just walked through for middle and high school. In this approach, we are still recommending to maintain the weight, the 0.75 for economically disadvantaged students. So this would actually generate additional dollars for our students in poverty to provide additional resources. So these changes would result in an enhanced EV base amount of $14,683. And then below you'll see the weights that we have included.
And Amanda, if you can just verify and just kind of reconfirm, the weights stack, right? So if you have a student who is economically disadvantaged and in a small school and is a multi-language learner, plus the base, that would be a really substantial amount of money. That's sort of standard practice with this kind of weighting.
Correct. They would be, just to clarify, as Jill was saying, they are stacked weights. So you would get, each student would get every weight they're eligible for. They are not multiplicative. So your size, your base time size does not times against, say, your economically disadvantaged weight, but you would receive every weight eligible. And circling back to Secretary Saunders' point, that's why we adjusted the CT center weight, because those students would receive the base as well as that high school CCR weight plus then the CT weight. So thank you.
And Dr. Brown, just so we've done it, identify yourself for the record.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Amanda Brown for the record.
Okay.
And Dr. Brown,
Did Dr. Brown do the last modeling or? Okay.
I
So
did, correct.
Is there a follow-up question to that?
No, is I hear Brad James has a contract with you all again. Is Brad working on numbers?
No, he does other work for the agency around.
yeah, his scope of
Education
work is
is-
not related to the education transformation.
Would it be helpful if we reminded folks of what APA does nationally?
Sure.
Amanda, do you want to speak to that and the work that you all do with other states nationally?
Yeah, so APA is Ogden Blick Pelation Associates. So we go by APA to make it a little easier to say. Our firm has been around since 1983 doing school finance work across the country. We've worked in every state at this point and have helped several states either develop or refine the funding formula that they use.
And part of the work for the APA is working with the entire team at the Agency of Education. And so as we're looking at all these numbers, there's a process that we've developed internally within the agency to ensure data quality. And where we have run into the challenges with inconsistent coding across the district, we've implemented data validation processes that involve the field. So as we talk about this work, it's really in partnership and working internally with our team to share the data. And then the expertise of APA is based on, actually the modeling for the overall system.
So who is the staff person within AOE that is working on this modeling that would carry on the work when we no longer have an expensive contract with an outside organization?
So I think there's a different question there, right? So what you're asking is, what is the approach for implementation versus designing an education transformation system?
I do think the
Yeah.
person implementing should, or at least the position should be involved right now.
Yeah, so as I said, this is a team approach. So as you're looking at this is wide scale transformation. So this is pulling data from across the agency, from across divisions, that has implications on how we deliver education overall. So this is a team approach and is also funneling into how we're aligning the agency to support with the implementation. But there's a different expertise that we're calling on now to help us in modeling the big picture and also bringing in expertise from folks that have done this work in other states. But it's not being done in isolation with the team at the agency.
Who will be the lead working with VASBO on the implementation of whatever foundation formula?
Yeah, so
we come up with?
the implementation isn't just about the funding formula. The implementation is around supporting the entire transformation. So I think it would be really helpful for us to come back and be able to walk through, the agency does need to take a very strong leadership role in this. And so as I've shared, we've outlined a transition strategy that is supporting academic enrichment, supporting operational excellence, and also supporting with the board strengthening work. So we are developing as part of our funding request, we're standing up a division to support with the transformation work, that once that transformation is more embedded, that team becomes a team that's supporting district and education quality. So we're standing up a whole division.
Generational education transformation. We would
Okay.
never rely on a single person within the agency. So members of team finance, multiple members of team finance.
What is
are
team
special
finance?
edu-
So I
Finance
think-
right now.
Yeah, so I think what your question is really
Not a
understanding.
division.
It's one of our divisions in the agency.
It's called team finance.
It's called the Finance and Administration Division.
Okay, who heads that?
Our CFO,
Who's that?
Cassandra
Cassandra.
Ryan.
But I think what's
But
really
again, it's not a single person.
Yeah, what's really important is the transformation is not just about funding, right? The funding is allowing us to deliver educational excellence in a way that's equitable. And so we are standing up a cross-functional team to build capacity of the agency, to support with academics, to support with operations, and to support with the school board oversight as well. So this is an exciting moment. I think it's really responsive to what we've heard from this committee, from the field, that we as an agency need to organize ourselves differently in order to support this type of a large scale change. It would be irresponsible for us to identify one person to be responsible within transformation, which is why we've asked for 5 permanent positions, and we're structuring a team around this work that will also be working in tandem with our finance team, with our student pathways team, with special education. So it's really exciting. I would love to come back and talk about that. It's completely aligned with what we're doing with the agency's strategic plan and allowing us to help deliver on this big work.
I'm sorry. Is Cassandra involved in this memo in any way?
The agency is involved in pulling together all of this data and information.
So when we no longer have a consultant, she will be answerable to VASBO about the assumptions and the equity based.
So the entire agency is involved in understanding what's going into this. So we've been having lunch and learns with the entire agency. So the people are understanding what's baked into this and what those assumptions are, and thinking about how does that change your work? How will you support the field better with these goals and with this structure? So it's exciting, but I would say that that's a conversation I think would be excellent for us to have as we're talking about the transformation work and how we're creating a very strategic project plan and timeline to support that. And I think to your question, it's really understanding roles and responsibilities and what scope of that work who would be taking the lead. We're excited to have that conversation with you because it's where all the work's going to happen.
And just to clarify, I think there's a misperception here that somehow these decisions are being made absent agency staff. So I think the secretary has articulated really clearly several times that all of these conversations involve multiple teams within the agency that are present during conversations with the fields, that are providing the data and making sure that the analysis is correct. This is an agency-wide transformation.
Who leads the sprint team that led to this?
We identified. So this is cross-functional.
Can you send us a list of everyone who leads a sprint team and what that's?
Yeah. So what we're doing that's really exciting is this is cross-functional. We're not scoping this to just one part. So we've engaged everyone in the agency. There's actually different leads that have been facilitating these conversations with sprint teams, different leads that have been helping with the focus group, and we've been pulling all of that together. And the reason we've done that is to be intentional around the different expertise that our teams have, the different relationships that our teams members have with the field. So it is really, as we said, as we've talked about from the beginning, when we went out to the Listen and Learn tour, it's an agency-wide effort. This is around how we're really leveraging the expertise and the talent of the agency to support this very cross-functional, transformative work that is not just about funding. This is absolutely not just about funding, which is really why we're coming here today.
Could I ask another question? So have all the sprint teams seen this memo?
The sprint team, no.
This memo was released to you all.
Are you taking feedback from them?
So this is all, iterative, right? So I have a meeting with the VSA trustees tomorrow. I think you have a meeting with a number of the Vs. So this is all kind of trying to pull these pieces together. This is really dynamic work. We've heard you ask a lot of questions. We've heard the field kind of put out some considerations. So what we're trying to do is to come together and really pull all the pieces in a way that's going to be responsible and really thoughtful around the overall cost of our system. And I think Senator Ram-Hinsa, what you're getting at is, what does that transition look like? I think that conversation is important.
What I'm getting at is we have less than a week to consider this and to compare it against other proposals that we have.
And we
need other people to help weigh in on whether assumptions made here or adjustments made here are sound and evidence-based. And I'm really asking you to level with us there, because we do have likely less than a week to see to better understand why we should change the trajectory we've been on.
So this isn't a change in trajectory. This evidence-based model has been part of the conversation since January. The bill that was put in front of you from the House moves to the evidence-based approach, but it does it in a two-phased approach. And so what we're suggesting is that which I think would be practically very challenging for the system. So your direction to move to one foundation formula, we support that direction, but we think we can do that in a way that is more evidence-based. Your questions
More
are
evidence-based than what? Than your original proposal
Than
or
what
than the
you're
proposals that we're contemplating?
Mhm.
Do you have a memo on how you believe these are more evidence-based?
This is an evidence-based approach, and what we are talking about is every assumption is made explicit. And that helps you as you're talking to your constituents and saying, what does this number mean? This number can support X, Y, and Z. And we have all of that outlined. And some of the assumptions that we've communicated here are very much in alignment with the intent language that you've included in your bill to ensure that we can expand college credits, that we can expand teacher salaries and a number of the other initiatives. This is helping you get there. So what we're responding to is actually exactly your question, which is how do we ensure that this is evidence-based? We're bringing you forward an approach where we have clearly expressed every policy assumption that goes into that number. And those assumptions are designed to support education quality. We know that we need to have flexibility within this approach, which is why we're not being prescriptive. But we would encourage you, because this is a roadmap for quality. It shows you the plan for what the future state looks like. And as we get into next legislative session and we're talking about quality, there may be other questions you have around what really needs to be required in our system and where do we have flexibility. But for this moment in time, it's really, really important that as a state, we can clearly get behind and explicitly articulate the assumptions built into a number, because that's so important for us to be able to show that through this approach, we can deliver educational quality. And again, it looks at the overall cost, not just the base and weights, which is the next part of what we'd like to
Can
get
I ask your consultant the same question though?
Dr. Brown?
Yeah,
Which
What
question?
that we have, Dr. Brown, less than a week to think about this in relation to other proposals that have been on the table that are policy choices generally, but we've had a lot of discussion and debate on them. How much do you open your methodology and your assumptions beneath a 5-page memo so that we are able to compare it to what we have already been
So
considering?
I'm going to pause before she
Yeah.
answers that.
For accuracy.
Since January, we have provided clear description around the assumptions behind the adjusted evidence-based model. And now what we're talking about are the adjustments for the enhancements we are proposing. This is not a new conversation. This is a conversation.
What date in January did we?
So-
look?
The evidence-based model is what we proposed initially with the governor's plan. It is what the House has been talking about and moving towards in the future state.
The bill dropped in late February.
Let's actually even go back.
I'm
further.
not sure
So
what
the
it's called.
Picus and Auden report, which is the evidence-based model, that's what it's called, was commissioned by the General Assembly, and that dropped in the fall. It's a
Yeah.
70 page document that has all of the assumptions of how the model is built. In addition, the Agency of Education released multiple policy briefs in January. So 80+ pages of policy briefs that has every single element of the adjustments made to the Picus and Auden model. So when we say evidence-based and we say thorough and comprehensive, we're referring to hundreds of pages of documents that have been released in the past 6 months. And now this, as you called it, the 5-page memo, is adjustments to all of that previous work, which has been presented. And the folks in this room have sat through it for many, many, many hours in this building for several months. So this is not coming out of nowhere. And it is based on a lot of documentation that we have presented and testimony that has been given through them for months.
Right, and so this is an overview of that. So we will be providing additional detail with a policy brief. Behind that, we have shared all of our Excel documents since January. So for full visibility into every assumption that's built in, we have also followed up if there were any adjustments made. That's what we're doing today. So it's a continuation of the conversation that I think is showing exactly what we wanted to happen from the beginning, right? In January, we said this needs to be a collaborative process. This proposal comes with a call to action to work together and make refinements. And we're doing that. And it's really, I think, representative of a lot of what you've talked about in your committee, what the House has refined, and also feedback we've received from the field. So it's a, it's a,
Yeah,
Maybe
I
Dr.
did
Brown
ask
can
the
speak
question
to-
of the consultant, and I wonder if you're telling us we can't ask questions.
No, it was a clarification
Okay.
of the question.
Just because that was a
it was
misrepresentation.
the implementation.
yeah,
What was a misrepresentation?
that this is a new idea as a misrepresentation.
And that
of
it
the
was
work.
based on a 5-page memo. So it's just clarifying some historical background. But I think please, Dr. Brown, if you want to respond.
No, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. So building on what has been said, I think taking just a step back, again, at the heart of this is the evidence-based model, which, as Secretary Saunders mentioned, was released in September, that really looked at what does it take to provide an adequate education, looking at the body of academic research that is available and school-wide best practice information. And the evidence-based approach itself, which is really, you want to think about it as kind of the foundation of what we're proposing here, the vast majority of dollars, has been developed over 20 years to identify what those resources are that would provide an adequate education to all students. It's been used in 2 states right now as the basis of their funding formula. Both states have court decisions that have been upheld that it is a valid approach to use, an
Can you name
evidence-based
those
approach to
2
getting what.
states?
Those 2 states are Wyoming and Arkansas. And so that is, again, kind of what I would think about as the foundation. So that evidence-based model that's been developed over the past 20 years and used in many others, in 2 other states, the model itself has been refined in many states. Then we proposed back in January what we were calling the adjusted evidence base. So it took all of the resources and research and built upon it to try to adjust for the Vermont context. So it added some additional resources around mental health, assistant principals, and a few other areas on top of that to, again, try to be more responsive to the Vermont context. Because that's generally how you would take the evidence-based approach and apply it in other states. It's developed nationally, but you want to make sure it fits where you're working. And then this most recent iteration, what we're calling the enhanced evidence base, is adding one more layer on top of that. So again, most of the dollars are coming from that evidence base. We added the adjustments on top of that. And now we're talking about a series of enhancements based on, again, what we're hearing in conversation through legislative committees, through bills that have been proposed, through feedback from the field, and through the sprint teams. What are areas that they think need further refinement? And this is in line with how the House bill was approaching using the evidence-based approach. They wanted to have an evidence-based approach that then was reviewed by professionals in the state. So this is an effort to do some of that work. Again, in the future, you could continue to refine it, and we would suggest that you always, how you fund education should regularly be revisited as your standards change, your expectations, any new requirements that happen along the way. It shouldn't be a one-time thing. It should be an ongoing practice. So just to, I think, close the loop on the question was, again, there's been a lot of work that has gotten to this point, and then we're talking about a new kind of enhancements on top of that. So that is the piece that's new for today.
Dr. Brown, I'll allow you to keep the floor if you want to walk through moving around the categorical and some of the additional adjustments we're recommending.
Yep. And I just sent a request to share screen, but I'm going to go ahead. Oh, looks like I can have the document in front of us.
Before we move too much further ahead,
Yeah.
there's a few questions I wanted to raise. Going back to my earlier question regarding the assumption of larger districts, I understand why the assumptions are necessary. It's also one of the bigger concerns that I have. So I guess my question is, with these weights, if there are no changes to the district sizes, is there any confidence that these weights would still provide a substantially equal education across the state with the current structures that we have?
That's a great question. So I would say that I think that these are all the approaches generally contemplated with a shift in governance. If we were keeping the districts as they are now, I do think you would want to revisit particularly some of the assumptions perhaps around size. We talked about you might want to revisit the district sparsity and have that on the table, or other district size adjustments. So I do think it's a good foundation of what you would want to have within your current system. But again, it was developed from a theory of action of you're having more a shift in governance structure, you're having more efficient operations than is possible right now. So I think you would want to revisit if you chose not to move to a different governance structure of, again, not a specific either 5 or 11 or 20, but if it was anything that resulted in districts having less than 4,000 students, there would be adjustments that you would need to make.
Understood. Thank
I
you.
believe that the assumption of every model you get.
Yes, so that's consistent with the modeling that the House has done, what you have been exploring in your committee. Scale factors into what you can deliver, right? And so you think about implementing this system is certainly it goes back to what do we want in terms of student opportunities, and are you able to deliver the array of programming and offerings? That's really fundamentally the question that we need to ask ourselves in terms of what are we hoping to achieve with quality. And so these assumptions are built on a certain level of scale to ensure equity in terms of what you're able to offer and measure in terms of quality. But like I said, you can go through the piece adjustment.
Just to clarify, are you referring to the proposals we've received from AOE or the modeling we've received from JFO?
Everyone,
Everything.
from everything you received from the House to JFO.
I don't think that's accurate.
So the cost function analysis that you looked at is assuming, you get to the analysis assuming 11 districts with the VSBA. So, you know, the, go ahead, you want to extend.
Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. The cost factor analysis from Dr. Colby assumes the current Vermont education system. The analysis that's been performed by JFO, we presented current law districts as well as VSBA regions.
As well as
SBA.
yes.
VSBA, so proxies for consolidation, also the printouts that we showed, that we presented over the last few days have been current law, and the
50-50.
the numbers included in the House passed bill are reflective of the Colby model, which is representing Vermont's current education ecosystem.
And that's 119 districts.
Correct.
In fact, just so you know, so and Julia can chime in, the cost factor analysis, the cost factor formula proposed by the House is really designed to be a bridge before you get to the evidence-based model. That's how their bill is designed. And so there is a reality that we're in a current system and we're talking about moving to a future system. And so what we're proposing, and we always have from the beginning since January, that there would need to be a transition period that did account for existing spending and existing structure, so that we can be supportive of moving our education system to this desired future state. Part of what we'd like to do today in these enhancements is thinking about some of the hold harmless approaches in terms of ensuring that we can have a smooth transition over a period of several years so that it is not as much of a shock to the system, and that we're doing that in a way that has a very clear roadmap to that future state, because all of the assumptions built in.
Yes.
Dr. Brown, I'm reading the first paragraph in an article from March of 2025 that says, last week, a Wyoming trial court ruled in a 186-page opinion that the state was underfunding its public schools in violation of the state constitution and ordered the state legislature to modify the school funding system. Local coverage described the ruling as a bombshell. Can you comment on that?
Thank you for the question. I don't have a full comment. I do know that Wyoming regularly revisits their school funding formula, so they are going through a recalibration coming up now. And they do that every 5 years to refine the evidence-based approach to make sure it stays at a level that's needed. So I imagine that it's revisited, but I'm not familiar enough with the ins and the outs right at the moment to say further.
I would say that any funding approach we would entertain as a state should and must be revisited to ensure that it's delivering on those expectations. So one of the things we would also talk about with this enhanced evidence-based model is including that cycle in our review. And as you're reviewing it, it's really important to understand, well, what are the goals we're hoping to achieve? And that being clearly articulated, this helps us to give a roadmap around what we expect to deliver with the funding in this model, because we're clearly articulating the assumptions baked into that. Dr. Brown, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So we've recapped all of the components in there, and applying those that kind of enhanced, as we're calling it, evidence-based base and the weights described above results in a foundation formula payment that's about 1.77 billion, or 6% less than the FY25 education payment. And so this is where we contemplate, well, what do you do with those extra dollars? Because as articulated at the beginning, our goal was to provide a robust, adequate education for students while staying within the constraints of current funding. So we wanted to think about how might you redirect those funds. So we are making some recommendations to changing existing categoricals and to provide funding for a transition period as referenced, that result in spending about 1% less, little less than that, compared to current costs of the system. And when we say current costs of the system, we're including both, again, the education payment and all those other education-related categoricals that are currently funded. So we have kind of 4 different buckets of funding that I want to talk about. The first being, there's a number of categorical grants in your system that we do not think would be necessary as separate amounts after moving to a foundation formula. They include the technical education grant, because we would now have a CTE center weight within the foundation formula that would generate funding that is at a level that covers both that technical education grant as well as current district tuition payments that they're making to CTE centers. Flexible pathways would also be covered within that CCR weight. And again, we generate enough funding in the per student amount to cover that program, as well as the other resources listed. English Learner Services, we now have a really robust EL weight that would generate that funding. And then the small schools, there's a grant right now for small schools and merger support that we believe having that really robust small schools adjustment that we've talked about, both with the weight and then that kind of tapering or softening of the kind of funding cliff that might be there, would cover that amount. So we think those things are covered under the foundation formula. We then kind of held constant or recommended keeping the current level of funding for state-placed students, PCB remediation grants, pension costs, OPEB normal costs, and other uses, as well as universal school meals. So again, these are all amounts of appropriations that are above and beyond the ed payment that we would want to keep in place for districts. We then recommended a couple areas of adjustments. So first being special education, we recommend increasing the amount of funding available from the FY25 appropriation was about 265 million up to 372 million. Again, this is reflective of costs that are actually incurred by districts. And this is something we spend a lot of time in the field discussing. How much do they currently spend on education compared to what do they receive through the census law, through excess costs, through federal funds? What are they paying out of their local budget? So we want to make sure that moving to a foundation formula, you fully account for those costs. So the modeling we have done uses the weights that were in the House bill, again, generating funding that would be at a level to cover current expenditures, as well as once you take into account the fact that we've put in some additional resources for MTSS in the base. We also recommend increasing the funding for transportation. Right now, the current appropriation covers up to 50% of costs. They can be reimbursed up to that level. We would recommend increasing to allow for 100% reimbursement. So we've modeled what would it take to essentially double the amount of appropriation that you have there. Again, it's a way of thinking about trying to account for the costs that districts are actually experiencing. And as you move from local budget decisions to a foundation formula, you want to make sure you're covering these pieces for districts so they're not having to pull those dollars out of their ed payment as they are doing right now. And then we recommended a new category of funding. So far we've talked about funds that we believe are categoricals that we believe are funded through the new recommended foundation formula, areas we think you're would continue to fund at the level they are today, areas we recommend to continue increasing. And then there's a new category of funding we would recommend that we're calling transitional funding. So you both want to think about how do you, over a period of time, support districts as perhaps they have a decrease in funding available, as well as time when you make increases to the funding that they might have available. So we are recommending kind of a 4-year approach to get there. In the first year, districts that have an ed payment that was higher than an amount that would be generated through the foundation formula, when you think about the total system, they would receive 80% of the difference in the first year, 60%, 40%, 20%. So in that 5th year, they would be at the new foundation level, but it's been phased in over time so that impacts are not as harmful to districts that have that change. If a district had a education payment that's actually lower than what the foundation formula would generate, we would recommend a similar tiering of phasing in the increases over a period of time. So 20% of new dollars in that first year, 40%, 60%, 80%. So using a phased approach like this would allow for implementation to occur without increasing the total cost of the education system. So something to keep in mind if you went with an approach where instead perhaps you held everyone harmless and gave all the new dollars out at the same time, your overall system cost would be much higher in the first year until that hold harmless goes away. So then table 2 is just comparing the FY25 actual appropriations to what we're proposing in the enhanced model. So both the comparison of that education payment, the new dollars that we would recommend for special education, holding state-placed students constant, increasing funding for transportation, not having a separate grant for technical education, small schools, essential early aid, or flexible pathways or EL services because they are covered in either the foundation amount that we've recommended via the base or the weights, or they are a part of that increased funding for special education. We then held universal meals constant and the costs around pension and such that you see in those later lines. So that results in a total difference that is a little less than 1% different between the two, or actually right around 1% difference. If we think about the hold harm, or actually, sorry, just under 1%, my bad. Then if we look at table 3 is really that transition funding. So that approach that I just talked about, where over time you both phase in decreases in funding and phase in increases as well. In the first year would be about $5 million more than the system cost that you see in this column right here, would be $5 million on top of that. And that would gradually decline until you hit that 5th year where you're now just funding at the new cost of the system. So it's very comparable to current spending, but it does mean that there's still differences between districts. And you've seen that really under every model that's been proposed. There are some districts that are really receiving funding less than what would be recommended under a foundation approach, and some that are receiving more currently. So what you see here in table 4 is a comparison by the VSBA region, their FY25 ed payment to what we're calling comparable ed spending. So that includes both the amount of funding you recommend from the foundation formula, so via the base and weights, as well as those new special education and new transportation dollars, but then netting out the difference from those categoricals that we think are already addressed in the foundation formula. It also excludes hold harmless funding for that transition, as that would be variable to year. So this is really comparing where are you now, where might you be going? And then it does not include those additional dollars that had been held constant in the system. So that original $260 million for special education, universal meals, those dollars are not a change between the two. So we're really looking at total comparable funding, as we're calling it, to the ed payment. And you can see the variability by district. So there are some districts that For example, Bennington increases by 10%, Addison decreases by 11%. So that's why you need to be really thoughtful about what does that transition look like over a period of time, both to make sure that those districts that have to perhaps do some changes in how they allocate resources or the efficiencies in their operations have a period of time to do that. So you don't want to do it day one in either direction, really.
I think another next step would also be helping to show the analysis across the different models that you've been looking at. What we're really bringing forward is the overall cost of the system. So focusing on the education opportunity payment is one part of it. And so it is really important for us to know the overall expense. And so the models in the house and what you've been entertaining are definitely more costly, and they're not taking into account the whole cost of the system. And so we think it's important to have that conversation and really be clear around the policy priorities to ensure that those can be funded to support education quality.
And just to add to that, being really thoughtful about areas that we named around special education, CTE transportation, for example, where we know costs exceed the funding that's specifically targeted to those items. So districts are spending other education payment dollars for those. So just being thoughtful about if they're not funded in one place, where they're coming out from.
So this table includes special ed and transportation. So
It includes the new dollars for it. It does not include the categorical funding that was available prior. So it's just trying to compare apples to apples. If they're spending out of their ed payment now for those things, what does it look like when those pieces are fully funded in the new system?
Yeah, and I know we were having these conversations early on too, to look about the other available funding that districts would access. So Dr. Friend, you could expand upon that. What are the other available funds outside of this comparison?
Yep, so outside of this comparison, again, would be those, if we were circling back up to here, I'm a visual person, so I'm gonna try to walk you through how I think about it. So what we have included in what you see below is really the difference between these two columns. So for example, in special education, what this shows is about that 110 million that's new dollars. So the new dollars are thought about here. It does not add up the dollars that were there before. So districts would also have access to those other special education dollars, the existing dollars for transportation, universal meals, all of those pension and other costs. So those are above and beyond. It again does not also include hold harmless. So if we're thinking about these dollars here, they would also be distributed to districts. Again, those you would see this 5 million, a lot of it going, say, to Addison or to Wyndham and Windsor.
So when we look,
And then it's not inclusive of any conversation around any additional local supplemental.
we're leaving out supplemental, but when we look at these numbers,
Yeah.
is it the case therefore, given what's not included, of looking at overall spending, a district that goes up by some number actually goes up by less than that because it doesn't include everything? I'm not being critical of models, but I'm sure I understand it.
No, I think it's a good question, and we have not, we can follow up to get more specific if you add in all those additional appropriations. I think it's still within the range of it, but you're right, it could vary slightly once you include those other dollars.
So, okay, so I just wanted to make sure if we're talking about up by 10% or down 10%, that we are able to think about it in terms of the entirety of spending.
That's right.
Rather than, and this doesn't, I'm not being critical, that's not my point, but this doesn't do that. This does only still a portion of the spending.
Yeah, so I think we can follow up with that information for you, for sure.
But there is some comparison we can do overall now, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think these trends that you're seeing here are somewhat typical in the other proposals as well, right? There are some districts that are up, some districts are down. And so that's why that transitional funding and what we talk about as hold harmless is really important, that Dr. Brown is kind of pointing to, is how do we kind of smooth the bumps in that transition period? This is an important part of the conversation.
My county has a heck of a bump.
Yeah, so Senator Arnesen, question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple. Dr. Brown, I won't belabor this. I'm not asking you a question about this. We talked about Wyoming. I looked at Arkansas and I think they are 41st for education spending in the country. So I just wanted to note that as I ask my question, because they do have a lot of poverty. The poverty weight is obviously noticeably lower in this construct and proposal than the one that we've been looking at in the House and Senate. I heard something in the background about that being an assumption around special education and poverty weights being related, but I don't see in here where the poverty weight assumption is easy to compare to the difference with the other model that we're looking at.
Thank you for the question. So I think I'll focus on the poverty weight, and I do want to name a couple things around that. So one, the poverty weight is somewhere we've made real adjustments from what the evidence-based recommended. The evidence-based weight would have been somewhere between 0.25 and 0.4. That one I'm not exactly sure on the range. So let me say that those are ballpark estimates versus the exact numbers coming out of that report. So we significantly increased the weight from what the evidence-based would recommend as part of what we would think about as adjustments to the model. And I want to clarify, the comment was not that there was overlap between the at-risk weight and special education weight. What I was talking about is we've really built a robust base that includes multi-tiered systems of support and response to intervention that provides those really strong tier 1 and tier 2 supports that can also be helpful to support the academic needs of really all students. So your economically disadvantaged students, your special education students. So I'm just naming that there are resources in the base to provide those kind of initial intervention services that need to be thought about in context with the base or with the weights. And to say, we were also saying that the weight that we're coming up with is being applied to a higher base, so it's a higher amount of funding than we initially recommended. It is lower than the weight that's coming out of the House bill, but I would also identify that the House bill and our bill, or not bill, that's not what I meant to say, this enhanced evidence-based model are really coming from different theories of action and underlying assumptions. So again, the House bill is coming from the cost function approach, which is really focused on what does it take within the current education system, current operations, current government structure and expenditures to adequately serve students. So that is one theory of action. We are coming from an evidence-based model that's really more of an input-based and focused on what would be needed, assuming a change in governance structure and increased operational efficiency practices that would be different. So I know it's a strong desire to want to compare the weights and the base out of both approaches, but they are really very different in what they're representing. So while there's quite a bit of overlap in them, perhaps in the amount of funding overall they raised or the weight levels, they are relatively distinct in how they're calculated.
Dr. Brown, would you mind, I know that you all had done early on with the adjusted EB model, you did sort of a national comparison as well. Would you, and so this would even be more, would you just speak briefly about how this proposed funding sort of compares nationally to other state education funding?
And if you're doing that, the base and the weight. So that's important. So there's kind of the research and the evidence behind. That's one thing that's important to articulate. And then there's the actual funding. And that funding that we're proposing has been adjusted to represent the Vermont context and explicit policy objectives.
Before we answer that question, can I make sure my question is answered? So 0.75, you're saying it's an input-based weight.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the inputs you have are significantly different than what students are getting on the ground today in Vermont?
That is a great question that I don't have an answer for. I know that they are a set of
also lower than the House. So taken together, this still is a much lower amount per student in poverty. So it didn't necessarily answer my question to say more money from the base, because more money is not in the base based on what the House sent us, and that's who we'd be negotiating with.
And I think that's entirely fair. And I just want to reiterate the difference in assumptions about governance and scale that are occurring between the two different approaches. So one is modeling what today structure and scale and approach and educational practices looks like versus a future state. So I just want to name they are intentionally very different things.
What happens at scale with low-income kids that you think is achieved at 3,900 students or more in a district? What services or supports are at scale that are different than when they are in a smaller school district?
Good question. I think I can speak most to what would our approach provide to those students versus how does it perhaps differ than what's happening now under current scale. So the weight would allow for all low-income students to participate in after school, before school, summer, to have that additional time. It would allow for additional interventionist support, additional social emotional support at a level that is above and beyond what the research would even say was best practice. It would also produce the weight we recommended would be one of the highest weights for at-risk on the country on one of the highest bases. Even I recognize that this base amount is slightly lower than the House bill. In either base is much higher than what you see nationally. I think there's only one or two states that are even above that. I think it's like New Jersey and DC, again, in my best recollection. So it's both at a level that's supported in the research as far as what resources are needed to support students. And when you think about it, both as an absolute weight and as an amount, when you contemplate the base it's applied to, would be some of the highest resourcing in the country.
Can you send me the main article or body of research summary that you used to make that determination?
Sure. Education of the Commission of the States is a great resource for what do base and weights look like across the country. So I'll send you their most recent version.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting because if your same citations were used in some of the PowerPoints that we've seen about district size being either, it can be really big or it's inconclusive, the citation from the state commission, or I looked at those. So one is someone's doctoral thesis at Illinois State University, and the other citation we received was this commission's report saying that it's essentially acceptable to the quality of a district to go from 25,000 students to 50,000 students in an urban area. So those are the two citations we received around district size. I don't know if those came from you and if that's what you're referencing.
I was referencing the question around base and weights. I was not referencing any question about district size. I didn't hear you ask about district size.
Okay.
So the reference I'm referring to is national reviews of state funding formulas, their bases, their weights is what I was referring to.
Were you referring to the research on how to support kids in poverty in a large district with these weights?
No, I was referring to the work that the evidence-based. So if we refer back to the report that Pike is not produced in September, I believe, of 2024, they have their full list of citations for where they get to the resources that are needed to support low-income students. And we have built on above and beyond that.
The legislative website, because it's a legislative.
So so I think what you're looking for is really understanding in great detail the research and the assumptions that are going into this proposal. So we've provided a number of resources. We can pull that all back together to make sure that you really, have that at your fingertips and are able to dig deeper where you might have more questions.
Yeah, I mean, if we're calling it evidence-based or enhanced
That's
evidence-based,
exactly what I call.
I want the evidence.
Yes, so
Yeah.
it's called evidence-based one. We talked about this. It is a specific theory of action to developing a foundation formula that is based on research. And we can share that again. But what we're talking about today and what we think this will help to empower you to do is to really clearly articulate what this funding represents, right? What is possible? How can we deliver educational quality through this amount of funding is really important for us as a state to articulate. So the cost factor analysis is based on, our existing spending and our existing outcomes. It will necessarily be more expensive to continue operating at our current scale. And in fact, that cost factor analysis is based on average student performance from 2019. If it were based on more recent performance from 2024, it would be even more expensive. So it's important for us to really think about how are we ensuring that we're delivering a quality and equitable education. Right now, we do not have an equitable system. We have students in different parts of the state who are not able to access the same courses. They're not able to access the same type of enrichment and after-school opportunities. We have a very persistent achievement gap when they're looking at performance for our students on free and reduced lunch. So what we're talking about here as we're transforming our system is how are we going to ensure that we're resourcing the system to deliver high quality education that is equitable. And that does involve considerations around scale. We know that this legislation will have a process to develop that scale. And I think there's really wide agreement around that from folks you've heard testimony around, and that there needs to be some more community process to that. What we're saying here is this is what this system could fund. And we are happy to provide additional resources. But it gives us a roadmap also as a state, understanding how we really deliver this. And all of these decisions really need to be based around quality and the resources and the expertise we think and research supports would best support our student achievement. So I think the question that we would have for you is, in terms of, next steps, what are some of the questions that you have that you would like us to be able to address at a future session? We know that it's the end of the legislative session, so we certainly are making ourselves very much available to this committee and being responsive to your questions and concerns, so we can help to support your work.
Yes.
One question, I apologize if I missed it. But is there anything in this that addresses inflation in any way?
And I think what you're talking about is year over year, how might this be adjusted? We can bring back those recommendations.
Okay, thank
But that would necessarily be part of any funding formula, and we represent that.
Yeah. Yes, and just to reiterate, all the dollar figures you're seeing are in FY25 dollars, so they would need to be inflated over time.
You would set up, we had it set up as our bill.
It's in the language. Yes,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
standard language.
Yeah, it's very important to do.
So one question that I have is around language and how much work you've got ready for us to hand
Yep.
legislative council.
We have it with us, yeah.
Going into
Yeah.
our bill, is it written
Yep.
to conform with our bill?
Yeah, it's minor. It's pretty minor. Y'all will be happy to hear this. Pretty minor. It's over in John's version as well. That's what's.
That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. What I'm hearing questions me to wonder if there are changes needed to the programs impacted by your funding recommendations, including career and technical education statutes, flexible pathway statutes, and pre-kindergarten statutes. So if that is not in there, then I would love an opportunity at the direction of my clients to talk about what changes be necessary there. They could be significant.
So some of those considerations are also related to governance. And so what we would suggest is that committee, there are some assumptions are also built in, to your point, around delivery, and that would also be considered with that committee's recommendations. Because we understand too, next session, you'll be able to have a deeper dive into the quality pieces as well.
I'm actually referring just specifically to the tuition sections. And all of the flexible pathways program have their own statutes with funding built
Yep.
into those. So is there language for those?
In our original bill, we provided a lot of legislative language.
There was nothing related to flexible pathways or career and technical education or pre-K in the H454 as introduced.
We can follow up with
Okay,
that
great.
because we have a lot to make some decisions.
Okay.
What was the assumption of how many districts? Did you assume that
That's a 11 from based on the VSBA regions that the JFO had modeled as well. So we did that for consistency, but we know those may not be the final
Right.
districts. But I would say to Betsy James' question, those questions would also apply to this bill as well, because there are implications for how you're funding the system, or there's implications for the cost of the system that need to be looked at. And so it's one of the next steps is we've gone through and where the bill is silent on any changes, how are we assuming that we are accounting for that cost? Those are things we'd like to bring forward, because regardless of whether the bill is silent, those programs need to be funded. And it is important for us to look holistically at that. And that has been our approach from the beginning, is to take a holistic view of this work, understanding that there are a lot of implications for program implementation.
Yes.
I feel like in that exchange, I heard that you have shared with us a comprehensive language around CTE.
We've been working really closely with the House Commerce. We've also provided, happy again to share, we've provided a lot of policy briefs. There's been 2 years of analysis around CTE in terms of making recommendations for governance and funding reform. And part of our model, again, the funding is an expression of the educational quality priorities, built-in funding to expand college and career exploration in middle school, along with 9th and 12th grade, and with a funding formula that understands a rate that understands the shared responsibility, so that we've been able to quantify the amount of funding that would stay at the sending school to support that child, along with the amount that would go to the text. So there's a tremendous amount of work around that. That is, again, all of that is built into these recommendations around weights, and that's going to be true for any funding formula. There are assumptions, and so what we think would be helpful, we could take every single weight and we can clearly articulate all of those quality assumptions that are behind that. And then next session, should there need to be changes to that, it gives you a really clear roadmap and a place to start. We're not starting from scratch in any area. There's a tremendous amount of work that's been done in every aspect of program delivery for our system.
So John and Julia, I know you just walked back in, but we've just walked through the memo and talked about some of the underlying assumptions. And I'm thinking about it. We had a bit of a discussion with Ben about drafting and language needed. And I'm just thinking about it from your perspectives. Is there anything you need in order to help us?
Sure. Yeah. Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. The modeling has not been shared with us. So the first step would be for the modeling to be shared. I have reached out to APA. I understand that. It's in the call right now. So I think that would be the first step. And then we can get into understanding what's included and assumed new numbers to us. So we are not ready to be able to support the committee in understanding what's behind them.
So the first thing is you need to.
So to clarify, APA and JFO did meet yesterday, so we can walk through some of those assumptions, and that work is ongoing. And we have a couple of points where we're also looking for clarity, right? So this is absolutely, a coordinated approach in this work.
So I just want to make sure that you're on the same page, JFO and the agency are on the same page here.
Yeah,
Information, the way that gets it.
Yeah, I think this certainly does not need to be a conversation. We can follow up offline. We did meet yesterday with APA. Some of the numbers included in the memo were not shared with us at that time. I understand that this is a fast moving process. We all have our internal work processes, and before JFO can do any analysis, we need to understand the enhanced model was not ready to be shared with us yesterday. So when it is ready to be shared, then we can follow up with questions, which is what we do. But right now, I don't have anything else I can comment on.
And we very much appreciate that collaboration. So look forward to continuing it.
So I guess just to be clear about this, we need to continue it fast.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
I understand.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think it's probably, and John, do you have thoughts to add?
Mine will be the least from a workload standpoint is my read of the situation, right? You would have to have the, I'm sure that Beth spoke to her pieces. For me, it's largely dropping in different weights. I'll have to craft a new weight for one of these that doesn't yet exist, but that is just dependent on what other people do. So it's not, I can think more about this, but I can come back if I have further thoughts, but right now I don't have anything to offer that's going to be helpful for moving things forward. Okay.
And can you then talk, or how does this work? How do you want this to work?
I think I need direction from my clients. I think we should chat.
Okay. Okay. Senator.
I just had a clarifying question. So, and Ezra might be able to help on this one as well, because of the scenarios you ran, did we have CTEs figured into it at all?
The modeling request was to exclude CTE
Okay.
For any additional weighting. However, any CTE dollars that were part of a school district's education payment from fiscal year 2025 would therefore be baked in to what you're seeing there, because
Alright.
the modeling, sorry for the record, Ezra Holden joined.
Yes.
It's just.
Great, because I like the idea that if you make a weight for CTE, it's gonna make it simpler. But I just wanted to make sure we were apples to apples when we were doing that, so.
Yeah, that's been really critical for us, is making sure that we're getting off the steps.
Yeah, that was part of the reason we appreciated the opportunity to come back, so that we're, again, representing all parts of the system as we're moving the foundation funding formula forward. Julie's point about this, maybe.
Yeah, I just want to say one more point. Sorry that I had to miss a chunk of the conversation. I was in finance working on the yield bill, but I'm back now. So I did miss a piece of the conversation. If it was already discussed, I will go back and rewatch it regardless. With respect to the CTE weight, that is a deviation from the current funding structure that we have in current law. I see everyone nodding, so I'm assuming you all already spoke about this. But I guess the only piece I will add, and I'm happy to talk more if that's helpful, is that thinking about CTE weighting, because that is a deviation from current law in terms of how CTEs are funded, for us to do any modeling, we would need to understand all of the corresponding governance changes that would align with, if there were to be governance changes, which I believe there would need to be, so that it's, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, and we would need to understand all of those pieces to be able to know how to model.
So we've, again, this is not a new conversation. We've been having this conversation since January, and we've been providing policy briefs that are articulating the assumed changes in order to apply those weights and to implement. So I think that's really important to reinforce. We can bring all of that back to the conversation, but from the beginning with transformation, we knew to be responsible with this work, we had to look at the overall system and make holistic recommendations, which is what we have done. And what we have heard in your conversation is questions around, what about this? How do we account for this? How do we support expanded current technical education? So we've gone back to what we've proposed, and we've refined that and built upon it based on input to come back with that holistic approach. That's really what I want to reinforce here is none of this is starting from scratch. This is all part of the conversation that we've been having since January.
I agree in part with that, but I think that the underlying question or issue is that it's still going to be unknown as to what the boundaries are necessarily going to be a year from now. I mean, the task force, it's certainly possible that the task force, section 3 of the bill isn't successful, and we end up with the same structure that we have currently. And so I think that's just one of the biggest issues. At least for me, it's one of the top issues. I guess that's a comment, but I do have a question, it might be for Ledge Council. Regarding what I just described, in the event that the task force doesn't create any new boundaries, they can't come to a consensus. With how the bill is written right now, what weights would go into effect, if any? Or what forms of effect go into effect?
So as is being, John Gray, legislative council, as is being proposed in this room, the changes, the updates to the weight are agnostic as to what happens with that's the proposal that's being discussed in here. So it would just come out on a particular date and you would have new weights agnostic as to whether or not the school district boundaries have changed.
But I might add is that it's not agnostic to quality opportunities. So funding may be agnostic to district, right? But I think when we talk about the quality of what type of offerings do we want to make sure every student has, there's a cost to that we need to think about.
Or even district operational sustainability. Because our current system, we have multiple districts that are struggling with their operational sustainability. Because our system is small and complex, and we continue to see that. So, for example, we have between 20 and 30% of our superintendents turnover every year. Similar numbers for special educators, special ed directors, similar numbers for business managers. So our system at the district level is constantly having churn and turnover, and that creates fragility in the system, which has implications for education quality. And so there's multiple concerns here
I'm
around
not,
our current system.
But I hear your question.
Yeah.
And I think as we kind of regroup, right, what we're doing is we're moving towards a better, more equitable system. And I think your question is, with this funding, are we moving towards that, right? And so what does that look like if we are in the current structure? And I think that's something we can come back to. But that's it. It's a good question. It's important for us to look at, right? Because we're all here to achieve those shared goals. We've articulated and looked at the fact that our system right now is not equitable. I think we're all really committed to getting there. So yeah, I think that'd be a good follow-up.
This doesn't fully respond to Senator Rasheed's question, but we should just note that we do have a second charge to the task force, which is to set up a system if the map is not adopted to help districts merge. Doesn't say they have to though. So it's not fully responsive to your question, but just an aspect of.
And I think what are those mechanisms? What does that look like? What are the alternatives?
Yes, I just think it's important to consider if the task force isn't successful, if things don't change on the district level with governance and district sizes and boundaries, we just have to make sure that if whatever weighting formula is involved in this will still provide adequate education across the state, or if these districts, if the map drawing is successful, are we gonna have two approaches, like the first one to be incorporated with whatever the new districts are, or the second one as a backup in the event that there are no new districts, but we need to apply that second backup formula because the task force wasn't successful. Something to think about.
Yeah, I understand the question.
Yes.
Do you have a sprint team for CTE?
Yes.
Who's leading that?
I don't have that in front of me. Forget it.
So all of the, do you mean AOE stuff?
Sure.
Is that what you're asking?
Who was leading it? Is an AOT staff person?
Yeah.
So we have, there's logistics here, right?
Okay.
So when you organize any kind of sprint team where you're bringing in multiple members of the field.
If this is too long of an answer, that's
No,
fine.
so we have, we just don't have it in front of us.
We don't have any CTE language, and I want to level set about that before we end, because if we are going to consider a CTE weight-in proposal, we need that language. And does anyone have language that I do not have, because I'm on the morning committee of jurisdiction? And we went over with Beth, every time it says CTE in the bill that passed the House, and she's very thorough in checking that against any proposal that came originally in February, and there's no additional language there. So that could be a hiccup with House Commerce, but I'm not sure how to resolve that or if you are taking any lead in resolving that in the next week.
Right. So different question than leading the sprint team,
Yeah,
right?
I just
so-
don't know who to talk
so-
about any language, so.
Yeah, so one, just to close the loop on the sprint team, we have a facilitator and content expert assigned to each.
Who is that person for?
So our content expert is Rich Turkey, but I think the
But that's
facilitator
a
is.
different question. than yours.
But the other question is looking at the proposal for the funding, and the legislative language tied to that. We can follow up with this committee because we've done a lot of work in making sure we're clear around those roles and responsibilities, the governance structure and the flow. And so that's the flow of dollars. So there's a ton of work, as I said, that's been building upon 2 years of a study and talking with CTE directors. They said, we really do need to make movement on modernizing our CTE infrastructure.
Are
So
you
that's been-
going to have language for us or not?
I think we do have it. I have to double check.
I think you have language.
Yes, we have.
Where is, like, where was it presented? Do you remember?
So I think you're asking us to follow up with the CTE specifics, and we are happy to do that. So I want to note that we provided 191 pages of language that wasn't fully reviewed either at the beginning. And so there's been a lot of different direction. We're really excited to hear that there's continues to be a focus on this committee for CTE. So this is an opportunity for us to bring that forward. I think it's a great chance. We'd be happy to come back and to talk through those details around CTE. It's really important to give those opportunities to our students.
Yeah,
Putting it in the weight, we gotta have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's
decided to go to that form.
It's the difference, but as you know, go instruction for CTE is comprehensives and the ones that are separately governed and the ones that are in districts and the funding is different or something.
And the good news is there's a lot that's already been done in this building over the past several months and
Yeah.
a lot of work that's already been done around this.
Yeah, so it's a great place to be.
Well, we've been granted a few more days, but I think we need to like come back in here tomorrow.
Okay.
And be prepared to make real progress.
Great.
So I think part of this is going to be, I'm going to meet with Beth afterwards, and then I'll be in touch with you
Okay.
and I'll meet with everybody here individually or quickly afterwards, and just make sure that we're clear about what we need and authority to keep looking for them. If we're going to head in this direction. Now that's an assumption on my part because it's the committee decision about which, do we are people prepared to continue? This is a, and I realize from your perspective, it's not a change of direction because like what this for us, it's a change of direction. From where we were with it would be well. So I want to get the committee's sense of.
Can I just ask one more question? Have this been presented to House Education?
No.
When is that happening?
Well, the bill is with you. And so we've been watching and listening to the questions that you've had to be able to come back in response to those. And I think the key thing that we've heard is making sure that we have a model that we can clearly articulate those assumptions behind that. And that's what we brought forward because that's what we started with. So we're in a great place and we're refining over feedback through this session.
And if we decide not to go with it, Senator, it'd be a waste of time until this committee had a good feeling about it, said, hey, I think we might entertain this.
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Okay, well, let me talk with everybody, make sure everybody's got access to what they need and that we're thinking quickly about the kind of language we're going to need and where and specifics and what JFO needs in order to do their work for us. Is there anything the committee is thinking about? Yes.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where to go from here, because if JFO can't adjudicate which weights are more accurate than the other weights, we're just listening to two parties' opinions on weighting and not quite sure how we're gonna resolve it. We're not the subject matter experts.
I don't
It's a
think
weird
that,
position.
yeah, so we are working with JFO. We were asked to come forward to the committee to share this approach, and we are working with JFO to make sure that you have that as a resource.
Ken, I asked the question the other day if they could adjudicate, because weights are very important to the equation. They told us that it's not not their purview.
For the cost function model or for the evidence-based model?
For any model.
For any model to explain
I
the
think it-
research
Look, I'm not
behind.
gonna speak on behalf of JFO, but we asked this question because we had two different sets of weights. And we asked the question, can JFO weigh in? Unintended, can they analyze the numbers?
I think what I'm hearing you ask is to,
No, I'm not asking anything, I'm expressing a frustration.
right, so to understand what is represented in those weights and what research and assumptions are going into those weights, I think is your question, which we can expand on.
I think we also, I think it's important. We have somewhat of a good problem in Vermont, and it is important to kind of recognize the context. Whatever decisions get made, we will have one of the most, if not the most generous education funding systems in the country. So that is sort of a foregone conclusion, and it's not a bad problem to be having. In most states, the question is, how much are we cutting? How much are we cutting? How much are we cutting? Right now, we're having a question about how much more can we add and still not add more cost to the system because we have to balance with affordability. So I do think Senator, I understand we're kind of down the rabbit hole of different academic approaches to education funding. I think you can look at the overall supports in the system for education quality, and we're getting down to, you know, again, a very, very, I mean, another very, very generous education funding system, regardless of where it shakes out. So I think also just that context is important. So I think we're on a good path, and we're actually closer than we think we all are.
So next follow-up, that's.
I would just say one approach is really thinking about our current state, and the one approach is thinking about the path to get to the future state, which will allow us to be, more equitable, ensure greater efficiency, pay our teachers more, right? Like we've expressed really clear goals to getting there. And so since the time of first introducing this model, we've made some adjustments to ensure that we can better support the transition to that future state. What the House was contemplating was how to get from the current state to the future state. The House was looking to get to the evidence-based model, which is what we're approaching. And then they looked at the cost function really as a bridge. And so what we're talking about is how do we actually have a consistent approach, a consistent methodology, consistent theory of action, and supporting the transition with adjustments over a 4-year period. That's what we're bringing forward. And exactly your question is what we're trying to answer is to have the consistency with the theory of action, because that gives a roadmap for how we'll deliver education in the state of Vermont, and also how the Agency of Education can best support that. And then the funding we've talked about in the transition is really critical to having this transition, because we know what that future state looks like. So that the House's plan actually contemplates 2 different academic models, which I think is where the questions are coming. What we're talking about is having one consistent approach and understanding of where we're.
So we're waiting.
Great.
And I fully respect everything you've done, that you brought back to the table. We've been now talking about this I think we've had the bill for 3 weeks only. We've known some of the elements of it beforehand. And I do agree that this is a very generous system that's being proposed, but it should be, because we're currently funding at the number 1 or number 2 cost per student in the nation.
Right.
So if we're not reducing that, we're not inflating that, we should be enjoying a very robust state support of the education system. Just frustrated that we have to figure out which weights are appropriate. And we're at the ninth hour. And the conversation, you know, we're 24 hours away from voting this out. And now it's just frustrating. We've got to figure out, well, how do we take your proposal versus the previous proposal versus earlier proposals and figure out the right method.
Can I,
That's the question.
yeah, can I speak? I'm gonna try and restate what you said. So the House bill contemplates both models built into one bill. So there was an intention that to get to the future state EB model, so represented in the House bill currently is a recognition of getting to a future state with the EB model. So the evidence-based model. So I actually think there is consensus there.
Yes.
So the House and the administration is saying this is the right model to get there. But there was concern about the transition from our current structure and organization and how do we do that and get there. So the approach that was taken by the House was to insert the cost factor analysis as the bridge. What we've done is we've said we can actually take the evidence-based model and help to get to that bridge without you having to contemplate both academic models.
Yeah.
So I actually think that there is agreement that future state, the evidence-based model is actually the right one for the system. What we're trying to respond to is how do we get there and do things like, you know, think about the hold harmless so that we're cushioning and smoothing it out while also building in additional supports that will frankly even more better is what I was about to say, because it's the end of the day, even better resource the system in a way that makes that transition smoother. And we also want to identify this. Best practice on this is like every 3 to 5 years, you all should be taking a new look at this base and weight, because as we move to better delivery of educational services, more regional kind of collaboration and delivery services, we should see that the system over time may actually cost less. And so you would actually do an iterative process. So I think maybe you don't have the problem that you think you're feeling right now is what I would posit. I think we're trying to give you the solution that gets you out of the bind. Because I understand what you're saying as well. You've got really two fundamentally
Senator Woods.
So, you know, it's a good thing for us to sometimes spin our wheels because we come up with questions, but, you know, we've got Ledge Council, we got two people from Ledge Council, we usually have a couple from JFO. The missing mention is AOE.
Yeah.
If we need to have somebody here, so if we're starting to get off track, even if they're on Zoom, then we can say, well, that's a policy question. Okay, so AOE, help us out with our policy question.
Yeah.
And I've asked for that before, and we don't have anybody from the AOE. We've
We'll have
got one more seat in the room that.
It's all that.
Going to be here.
We'll be in your.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we appreciate that.
I
I want to get to Julia before.
I just really want to underscore Senator Williams' point and just say this is not normal. We've heard you say that people are watching us and, you know, listening to our hearings, and you don't need to have someone in the room. But I mean, we've had multiple days of conversation lamenting that there's no full CTE proposal, and that if it's all down to a misunderstanding, no one has said anything from AOE. We're the Senate Education Committee. We have jurisdiction of this bill.
So we asked to be included in this conversation because we want to present the full proposal. We want to be involved in that.
What has been the hang up with having any of these people leading any teams, all your team? What has concerned you about having one of them in the room when these topics come up?
I'm not really understanding the questions.
Why isn't anyone else from AOE given permission to sit in here and help us with this work?
I have staff from AOE all in the building. I think we had 3 different people on testimony this week. So that's not an accurate reflection of how we manage our team. And I explained to you before, we have a meeting every Monday with our policy lead and subject matter experts across the agency, where we're reviewing information and identifying who will provide testimony on a variety of different topics. So that's not an accurate
Have
characterization.
any of them been in here?
Have you received testimony from other AOE staff throughout the sessions?
Are you saying
The
you don't want to see us anymore?
All we're asking is, we want
Yeah.
either somebody on Zoom
Yeah,
or somebody.
I
up
hear
in
you.
the seat
Maybe as a
We'll-
here and there.
maybe just as a
Yeah,
touch to get us over.
we'll be here. And
Yeah.
where there's specific areas where you're talking about like specific subject matter expertise, that is absolutely possible. And that's been happening all across session in a variety of different House and Senate committees. What we're talking about today is a holistic approach. So we're excited that we can bring this forward. It sounds like there's some additional interest in diving deeper into CTE. We're really excited about that. So we'll coordinate for our team to be part of that. Absolutely.
So,
I'm getting a speech and coming back. I'm
Okay.
for breaking.
okay, well, we're not breaking.
Okay, I'm coming back.
It's not, whatever. So I want to make, we've got a really limited period of time here. We've got modeling to do and we've got drafting. And we need to, by the time we leave here tomorrow, we've got to have this really pulled together where we're going and how and who's doing exactly what and how the pieces are going to fit together.
Understood.
So Julia,
I'll
I just
order
want to
them.
reiterate,
At a late night.
you said the first thing you need is,
For the modeling and all of the underlying assumptions to be shared with us.
And I
given-
just saw Julia's email, so she's already on top of that. So we'll be connecting.
so.
Yeah, and it's 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. I just want to share that having not seen the updates to the model, I don't know what we can do because this is all new information to us.
Yeah, and then the question is,
I want to also flag that part of the delay for the AOE was not getting the information. So this is all, we're trying to move quickly and everyone's trying to do that work. It just,
when you said do what is it that you would do? What is it, what would you would suggest we might want from you?
That would be a question for the committee.
I
If the
understand that, but
committee
help
is,
us.
if the committee is interested in us trying to help you all understand the underlying assumptions, the way that it functions, the mechanics, we first need to be able to understand it ourselves. And right now, we do not.
We do want that. So, okay, so the materials, everything you need is on its way to you from.
I don't know.
I'm not asking, you,
Oh.
I'm actually looking for it.
Oh.
Yes, okay.
Oh,
I think
Amanda-
he was looking over your head. Yes,
Okay,
it will
so-
be right after I'm done with this meeting. I'll get that over to you.
I think the other piece from our perspective is typically we do modeling that corresponds either with a very specific request, which generally is reflective of legislative language. So some of the very and these are conversations we have had, JFO, AOE, the consultants over the course of the session. JFO often needs to look at language in order to be able to say, like, this is exactly what is being assumed here, so that we know we are accurately modeling it and including that in our assumptions. So that would also be very helpful for us.
And what language you're talking about? Bill language.
Correct.
Bill language, draft bill language.
Correct.
Okay, which we're getting.
and again, what we're proposing is an enhancement, right? So what we put forward originally included 191 pages of legislative language, along with a number of data files and work where we identified policy assumptions. So we're starting from there. And now we're coming back with these enhancements that we've identified. So I think it's important to recognize that there's been a lot of information shared, and we're building upon that. And we're all working at an accelerated timeframe. And I think this conversation was really to share the approach. Ultimately it's your decision, right, around how to work with CAFO and the Coach Council on the direction. So that's where we're, I think, all trying to come together to make sure that there's consensus and an interest in pursuing this, and we can work in earnest in as accelerated fashion as we can to bring you back the information that's necessary.
So let us all reconvene here, for us early tomorrow, so we'll have a longer Friday afternoon, so we can shoot for 1 o'clock.
Okay.
And you're gonna come with some specific language, some of which you've already done, I understand, but at least packaged and put together and thought through about how it fits into our existing bill. And okay, and information's coming, so, okay, that's, I think, what we can do for today.